All right, welcome back to English 101, Rhetoric 1. This is our rhetoric and writing lecture for week 14. And we're going to cover a few things, so it may take a few minutes, but I'll try to go through it as quickly as possible. And as always, as you're watching this, because I'm going to go pretty quickly, you can always pause the video if you want to. I mean, of course, you know that. Just a reminder, in case you want to look over some, especially with the pronouns and the quotation things, where I'm going to give you some quick examples of how to use those correctly. So we're going to start with pronouns. If you have the Hardbrace Essentials book, it's on page 299 to 314 if you have the third edition, I think, and it's section 21A to F. So there's quite a bit there on pronouns because they can be kind of tricky to use. And of course, pronouns are one of the most important parts of speech to be comfortable with because you always have to have a subject and a verb in every complete sentence. And a pronoun is one of those options for your subject. It's either going to be a noun or a pronoun. Pronouns, word that refers to a noun or replaces a noun or noun phrase. And then it has its antecedent, and that's the word that it's actually replacing. So we're going to talk about those two terms as we go through real quickly here, a little bit about pronouns. So if you look at this antecedent, again, that's the word that's being replaced, John. Down here, the participant with the most experience. These are our antecedents in red, and we replace those with something. Now, obviously, if we didn't have pronouns, we'd be repeating John over and over. It would be very awkward, right? So pronouns are convenient, but again, they're good to be able to recognize because oftentimes a lot of times they will be the subject, but not always of a sentence. In this case, they aren't. But in blue, we have our pronouns he, which is replacing these two antecedents in red. Personal pronouns, one category that we use probably most commonly. They refer to people, places, things, ideas. So I, me, you, he, him. These are all personal pronouns. And again, they're going to be replacing, I is going to be replacing Tom or you, and so on. If they're plural, of course, we want to make this always match. And one of the biggest problems with pronouns is we have what's called pronoun antecedent agreement problems. And so when we say I, but we're referring to three people or something, of course, those are things where we have the number singular plural mixed. You can also get other things mixed up, but that's a common one with personal pronouns. Possessive pronouns, of course, like it sounds, possession, to show ownership. These are also, of course, very common. These are some of the most commonly confused and confusing forms. And if you look at the bottom, so we have singular, mine, me, my, mine, your, yours, his, her, etc. And then our, ours, your, yours. These are plural. And these are all possessive pronouns, meaning it's our car, it's my pencil, it's your book. These are their things, something like that. But it can be very confusing because they get confused with what are called contractions very often. And so like its is IT apostrophe S, which means it is. And that can be confused with the possessive pronoun up here. Every dog has its day or something like that, right? So this shows ownership, but this is literally it is. Now, if you ever have any confusion about this, we talked about this in the commonly misused words before, but the easiest thing to do is just read it as if you're putting in whatever's missing because of this apostrophe. So it is. If you read it literally like that, you're not going to say every dog has it is day, right? That's going to be wrong. So same thing with there. You have the personal pronoun up here, which is possessive. Not personal, sorry, but possessive pronoun there. It's their house. Down here, they are. So again, if you read this there, if you read the A in here, they are, you're not likely to confuse it and say it is they are house. So again, this is easy to just gloss over when you're typing fast probably. I make these mistakes, but when you go back in your editing and proofreading, you probably want to check all your these contractions and personal pronouns, but especially it's, their, whose, this is who is, because you have your apostrophe here. We don't have the personal pronoun who's up here, but that can be a possessive pronoun as well. So again, these get really confused, so I wanted to mention these. And reflexive pronouns are only used when you're directing the action back to the subject. So I saw myself. So I'm looking at the camera right now. I see myself. And it's literally the action is being directed back to me, right? I'm pointing back to myself. I myself judged or questioned the judge. Now, what I notice a lot of people doing, and it's not only inexperienced writers, it's lots of people, but they use reflexive pronouns to sound more formal when they're not really reflecting back on themselves. So like, for example, myself went to the store. That might sound kind of obvious and weird, but you wouldn't want to say that. It may sound more formal, but it's not reflecting the action back on you unless you said, I myself went back to the store. So it's kind of confusing, but again, with these reflexive pronouns, just like the word reflexive sounds like, it's reflecting back to the subject. myself, yourself, himself, herself. So you wouldn't even say, if you said he first, then you could say himself, because you're kind of, see how it's repeating the subject and reflecting back. Ourselves, yourselves, themselves. Using a reflective pronoun as a subject doesn't work. So we're looking for that always when you're trying to find out if you have good sentences. Do you have a subject? Do you have a verb? And if you have one of these reflexive pronouns in there, it's not your subject. We don't want to use those. Mr. Palmquist and myself. See, it sounds kind of formal, kind of good, I think, to some people, but it's really better to say Mr. Palmquist and I discussed our concern. So again, these are not normally used as subjects, and it's only reflecting. So those can be pretty easy to misuse. Let's take a quick look at what you need to do to use pronouns effectively. So first of all, you need to understand the person. And we've talked about this quite a bit in the class when we talked about the short stories we were reading. Some of them are written in first person, right? So that's like I, me, you, I, me, we. You know, it's I'm talking about, you know, from my perspective of the first person. The second person is you, and then third person is he, she, it. You know, and so when you're using pronouns, you don't want to switch from like first person to third person. That can be very confusing to the reader. Also, number. We talked about that a minute ago. If it's plural, then make sure your antecedent and your subject are both plural, not one singular and one plural. And then the case. Case is a little bit confusing, and I won't go into that too much, but it has to do with what part of speech the word's being used as. So let's look at this first part. Person indicates whether a pronoun refers to the writer. First person, I, right? We. That's that's the first person. To the second, to the reader more, and this is not that common. And some people say never use you in academic writing. I don't think that's necessarily true, but as a rule, we tend to write more in third person in academic writing. Unless you're writing a really personal essay, which we did some in this semester, you would use first person. Second person is kind of odd because you're addressing the reader, so you're writing, you're saying, do you like this paper? Do you understand what I'm saying? So it's a little bit different. You don't use that a lot in academic writing. And then third person, we usually, he was the person in the room. What was her answer? We're talking about this objective thing over here. So again, when you use one or the other in your paper, unless you have a really good reason, you probably want to stick to it as you go through a paper, either first person, second person, third person. And, and of course, your pronouns, you'd want to keep those consistent. Number, again, singular, plural. So I went home, we went home. Do you have the book? When did you dance? So if you are using plural, probably, again, it's more about being consistent, making sure your pronoun and your subject match, whether plural or singular. And sometimes it's not something like home. This sentence, it's not going to matter because we only have one subject. In some senses, it'll be more obvious. But probably the thing here is to note while you're writing that you're staying kind of consistent as you go through, depending on the paragraph to paragraph, how that looks. And then case. Case refers to the form a pronoun takes. And that's basically, is it the subject? Is it the object? Or is it like ownership? We looked at those possessive pronouns. And again, that's going to make you choose something different. I solved the problem, not me solved the problem. And that just has to do with the case. These are kind of hard rules to learn. There's a lot more in the textbook about it. But because this is the subject, we're going to use I, which is a subject pronoun, not me, which is more of an object pronoun. But if the problem was solved by me, that's a different thing. And you probably heard that before, where people try to decide whether to use who or whom. And that's the rule that's happening here. If something's a subject, you're probably going to say who did it. And if it's an object, you'll use the other one. So that's what we have here. Marissa and I solved the problem. So I is, again, part of the subject. He and I join the team. These are subject pronouns. All these are acting as subjects of your sentences, so we're using I. If you go to the objective, the whole staff admired him, not he, right? The staff sent him a card. Now we're in the objective case. And what that means is, if you think of the very most basic sentence, I hit the ball, I is the subject, hits the action or verb, and then ball is the object. So we're looking at the objects here. And we choose a different pronoun. So the whole staff admired he. No, the staff admired him. We would use that. They will appoint you or me, not they will appoint you or I. Actually, a lot of people think I would be, but I is a subject pronoun. It sounds right. Sounds kind of academic to me or learned, but actually me is the correct one there. All right, last one, the possessive. Of course, we're using these like their, our, yours, and your. So just quick stuff on pronouns. If you wanted to take this little quiz really quickly, You could pause the video and I'm not going to slow down for this too much because again, I want to make this video as quick as I can so people will hopefully watch at least part of it. But here's the answers if you did take a second to that. The board of directors asked me, my brother and I, he and his cousin, they asked me, and then ourselves. That's that reflective, ourselves is reflecting back to we. Again, if you want to pause this and take a look and figure this out, and you could also go back to the book. I think most of these I might have taken from our textbook. All right, really quickly, let's talk about integrating quotations. I just want to share a couple of things. We've talked about this several times, but again, key to avoiding plagiarism is always making sure you cite your sources. You don't have to do it perfectly, but let me just share a few things that can help you make it a little easier. This is a quote we're looking at. So this is our source text. This is all about the Mississippi River, and we're just going to see how you can quote from this accurately. So you can, again, if you want to pause this and go back and look at these slides, you could do that. I'm going to go a little quickly through this to get to our last part. So if you're using an exact sentence from a source with no changes at all, you put quotation marks around the whole sentence, right? Use a signal phrase. And remember, a signal phrase is like this one, McNeil and Cran. Now, if you remember, McNeil and Cran are our authors that we're just using this as an example of a source to quote from. And so McNeil and Cran, that's our, they write, that's our signal phrase. Sometimes we call it attributive tag. It doesn't matter, but you're signaling, right? You're tagging that this is a quote. And then you have your comma and you have your whole sentence in quotation marks and you have a page number in parentheses. So if you're, and then you're going to have to obviously have a work cited at the bottom, sources cited. And we haven't done a research paper this semester, so I haven't really required this. When you go to 102, you definitely will want to know this. If you take 102 sometime in the near future or ever, you'll have to write a research paper. And probably, I'm sure the professor will review some of this, but again, we're doing it just real basically, but still, if you do quote from anything, I want you to try to do it as correctly as possible. On language, now here it's the same thing, but they've just divided and they put their signal phrase in the middle, right? And so they put a quotation inside the comma, rather inside the quotation marks, and then one at the end of the signal phrase, and then again the page number and the period. So that's if you're using just exact sentence. If you're using a few exact words, so sometimes you just want to put a couple of their words, only those go in quotation marks. You can see right here, same kind of format, but we have a comma. The English language, according to McNeil and Cran, now you're still giving, attributing it to them, but you just have these few words that you borrowed from them, and you still have the page number. And then if you're paraphrasing or summarizing the source, using the author's ideas, but not any of the exact words, you still want to give credit. So it sounds like you wouldn't, but introduce the ideas with a signal phrase and put the page number, just like we did before, right? McNeil and Cran argue that changes, so they sort of mention that they're borrowing these ideas from McNeil and Cran, but they didn't use any of their exact words. They summarized it. Remember, there's 3 ways to avoid plagiarism. One is to do direct quotation, one is to summarize, and one is to paraphrase. So we're doing summary here. All right, and finally, this is just an example so you can see a plagiarized example. McNeil and Cran claim that, like a river, English creates waterways and discards old ones, and then they cited it correctly here because they actually used the exact words from McNeil and Cran here, but they just didn't put the quotation marks. So it's little things like that can be considered plagiarism. And again, I just want to make sure you're set up for that because that's one of the things that we in the English department kind of worry about a lot. And I don't want you to get into trouble if you go into English 102. So a little bit more about this. Most people are doing this well, by the way, if you're watching this. So that's good, but it's important for me to just do a reminder here near the end of the class. All right, we're going to talk about something, and I wish I could sit face to face with everybody. I just had a class where we really have been discussing this, and it's better. But I'm going to go through it and talk with you a little bit about something called stasis theory. And I put this right here: agree to disagree. And this is a very old theory. Now the college is located in Cicero, and this is supposed to be an image of the Cicero, who was a Roman orator back in ancient Rome, who's the namesake for Cicero, and he's responsible for a lot of the fact that we actually know about stasis theory because it's from very ancient Greek texts that were lost, but Cicero had quoted from these quite a lot, and so we have a history of them because of him. So you can either be grateful or mad at him over that, depending on how this goes. But stasis theory is, I think, a very interesting way to get to the point you actually want to argue about, that you feel like you can write about. So the reason we're looking at this, and I'm going to bring up some kind of controversial stuff here, because I think it's the only way to really understand what stasis theory is. So let's just jump into that. But again, what we're looking at is it's a way of asking questions to try to understand what our best argument might be on a certain topic. So let's just go through a really silly kind of example here. Imagine you're disagreeing. We just had a disagreement recently, let's say. A couple of people, I was talking to one of let's say the soccer coach at Morton College. And I said, I think really, Morton College's soccer team, the men's soccer team in particular, should have solid blue uniforms. I mean, that's what I'm thinking. And then this other friend who was with me, he said, um, you know, um, I think Morton College men's soccer team should have uniforms that are made of natural fibers like cotton. I said, yeah. So I'm back to A, right? I'm A, he's B. I disagree. Blue is much better, I say. Blue is better than cotton. You might start to see something weird here. This is a little disjointed maybe, but that's where you're wrong. Cotton is the obvious choice because it protects the environment. So, well, it's hard to argue with that. I mean, I think it's natural fibers are probably better than synthetic things. Do you understand anything about tradition and school spirit? Blue. I'm not going to scream right now. It's early Sunday morning. But anyway, all this bad, so I get very upset at the end. Now, again, this is just to try to illustrate a point that if we're not arguing about the same thing, it's very easy to get heated, to get upset. You could get upset even if you were arguing about the same thing. But the idea of stasis theory is we're trying to connect this. So if you think about this, how might we, kind of connect these two ideas? And if you want to pause this and just think about it for a minute. In other words, the two A and B are not arguing about the same thing. What could we do that would make this conversation more of we would have what we call achieving stasis, where we have a stable, stasis is like having a stable ground, right? Is what I think it literally means from the Greek. What could we do? So again, if you want to pause this and then I can sort of tell you what I'm thinking. So let's just imagine instead of this person says blue, the other person says orange. Now we have stasis, right? Blue and orange. We can debate the merits of blue versus orange because you've heard the old expression comparing apples and oranges. It doesn't work. You need to compare the Gala apple to the Fuji apple, right? You don't want to compare apples and oranges. They're too different. So that's the problem here. And then we might say, what about cotton? Well, I think we should have suede uniforms. That'll be comfortable for the players. So suede versus cotton. Suede's very durable, but cotton's a little more breathable than suede. So we go back and forth, right? But we're arguing on the same page. And that's what we're talking about here with stasis theory. So if you've gotten this far, congratulations. But this is, I think, to me, a really useful thing. It can be used in all kinds of situations. Here's an example of something that comes up, we hear about, right? Sexism and racism. So we're going to focus, this is from a website too, if you want to see more detail on this. I just borrowed this right from the website there at the bottom earlier. So some people do not feel that sexism exists while others are adamant that it does. To come to an agreement, you could apply stasis. That's what we're looking at here, theory, by first asking, does it really exist? So again, you could take a minute, ask yourself the question, does it exist? Do you think it exists? Do you believe it exists? And this is just fact. We call it just fact, or an instance of it exists, or it's in existence. So you could ask yourself that question. Next, you and your friend would need to define and discuss what acts make up or constitute sexism. So if we went through a list, like in class recently, I was talking with students, some people said the way that we use language can be sexist. Like, let's say, for example, my daughters accuse me of mansplaining, and I do that with students sometimes, right? And do I do that more with female students than I do with male students, or do I do it equally if I'm over-explaining things, because that could be perceived as sexism. That's a very simple thing, but communication, right? Other more serious things are, for example, let's say that somebody was paid more money because of, women at this company, they have the same job, they're paid less than men. And we know that there are facts of, that does exist in certain instances, right? So that could be a really serious example of sexism, or getting a promotion over somebody. So workplace, communication, there's a lot of areas this comes up, but it's treating somebody. So we'd have to define it. We'd have to come up with sexism is, and we'd have some kind of definition. Then we ask ourselves, what's the quality of this thing? Is it right or wrong? I think most of us probably would think either sexism or racism, we're talking about sexism here, is wrong, right? And why is it wrong? It harms people. We could think about these different things, lots of questions we could ask. And finally, there's the question of policy. And anytime you're trying to decide on a topic, and again, you can see how you could go through all these questions with any topic to help you get to a manageable or an arguable topic. So what's our plan of action? I think we should do, maybe I should consider my own communication style when I'm communicating with people, making sure it's fair to both, to male and female students, or or whatever that might be. Or we could also look at like workplace policies, and if we work in a company, we could advocate for women and different things like that. So we have to come up with some policy, a plan of action. So again, this is basically just what stasis is. You're looking to try to find a more stable place to argue from. And so, this question comes up: what are you actually arguing about? You might have been in a conversation before with someone, and you just sort of stopped suddenly and said, "What are we even fighting about?" I don't know if you've experienced that, but some people say they have, and that's because there's no stasis. You're talking about two different things. One of the most important things to know in writing an argument paper is what exactly are you arguing for or against. That sounds like common sense, but sometimes we're not really sure who our opponent is, so to speak, who's got the opposing viewpoint. So being clear about opposing viewpoints is really part of this. Many common arguments taking place at the national level, I believe, this is just my opinion, cannot be resolved because neither side understands the real issues, or they're not willing to talk about the real issues. Some examples of this, and this is where it can get kind of offensive, so I apologize but these are just so recognizable. You see these all around. So I want to bring up a couple of just really basic things that have been ongoing debates, and nothing seems to be resolved, and there seems to be a complete stalemate. And my argument is it's because stasis has not been achieved or even looked for in any of these issues. So let's look at the first one. So this is obviously a very controversial topic, abortion. We just had Roe versus Wade overturned. So you have, usually in this, there's two clear positions. There's a pro-choice and a pro-life position. And to put it very bluntly, and I'm borrowing this from a textbook, which is, I have to cite my sources, right? Ancient Rhetorics for Contemporary Students. And this is a fairly, I'm borrowing all this right from their textbook. And in that textbook, they basically say the pro-life position is, they're saying abortion is murder. So that's their position. And the pro-choice position is saying a woman has a right to make decisions about her own body. So again, if you go back to the cotton and suede, or the blue and cotton, or, we had the debate about the uniforms, we weren't on the same page. I think you can see how this is kind of the same thing. Abortion is murder, a woman has a right. These are not opposite. These are not arguable, because this side is saying something and this side is, it's almost like non sequitur. We talked about the logical fallacy, non sequitur, that which doesn't follow. There's kind of a disconnect. And to argue, to have a real conversation, you have to move this so that some part of these two things are meeting. So you have stasis and you can have a real debate. You can't debate two different topics at the same time, and that's the problem here. So one thing we could do is we could go through and look at all the stasis questions. Does a problem exist? What is a problem? If we were in class together, I'd ask you right now to take out a pen and paper, or get your tablet or computer handy, and just work through some of these questions. If you want to do this, you can. And let me tell you how I would do it. You first have to kind of take a side, so to speak. I think you'd have to say, does a problem exist? Yes, Roe versus Wade was recently overturned, and that presents a problem because women's rights have been infringed upon. Or if you're on the other side, you could say, does a problem exist? Yes, abortion is murder. We can't have that. So you could take either side you wanted to, and you could just talk about what that problem is. You can't be on both sides. You have to, to do this activity. And then a definition. What kind of thing is it? So you have to decide. It's an infringement on people's rights. It's taking away rights that have been guaranteed for 50 years, or it's a kind of a crime, because it's murder. You'd have to look at either side of that. And then the quality, is it good or bad, better or worse than something? Should this thing be sought or avoided? And then finally, a policy. Do we need to have a policy? Do we need to make a change? And that would be where you'd get to. So again, we're not gonna go through all this because we're not in class together, but these are the questions you ask to try to get to stasis. And eventually what you might come up with all kinds of things. And I've had lots of good discussions about this in class, but one really simple, without changing anything from our original slide, would be, here you could debate this. So this is the pro-life side, right? Abortion is murder. And then on the pro-choice side, abortion is not murder. You'd have to decide, you'd have to be very specific. You could talk about, lots of things, and you've probably heard debates about this, but this is actually something that's debatable because they're both on the same footing, basically, and there's stasis here. We may not like to talk about it, but it is something we could debate. A woman has a right to make decisions about her body. Remember, that's the pro-life choice. So if you really want to debate that, you have to debate a woman does not have the right to make decisions about her body. So these are our two, stasis points based on this. And again, this is just an idea. It's an old idea. It goes back to ancient Greece, and it was kind of revived in ancient Rome, and we still use it. And I think attorneys use this, but I wonder sometimes, because my understanding is most of the lawmakers in Washington and Springfield went to law school, but I don't see them using this. So maybe it's out of fashion now. But I like the idea of trying to achieve stasis with, our issues. Let's look at one more real quickly. This is obviously the gun control Second Amendment. It's one of the probably second most prevalent debates we hear. So same thing, we go through the same process. Second Amendment advocates are going to say gun laws of any kind infringe on the right to bear arms. And gun control advocates are going to say gun violence can be reduced through legislation. But again, you can see, if you look at this closely, we don't have stasis. We're not arguing this. We're on two different topics, two different levels. It doesn't connect. So how can we connect it? We go through these stasis questions. Again, we ask, does a problem exist? And if you did this, what you'd want to do is ask these questions yourself and maybe answer them. And you'd have to take a position again. You'd have to be on the Second Amendment side or the gun control side. And then you'd maybe get to something like this. Gun laws infringe on the right to bear arms. Gun laws do not infringe or don't need to infringe on the right to bear arms. Gun violence can be reduced through legislation. Gun violence cannot be reduced. So these are really states, and I don't really feel like I ever hear this kind of logical debate around these issues. So that's why I brought them up. They're real common, and I think it illustrates hopefully somewhat this idea of stasis theory. Again, if we were in class, I would ask you to work with a partner right now. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. You and a coworker are closing the store when you realize, you have to imagine you're working in a store, retail, $200 is missing from the cash register. And I don't think I have any students named Daryl right now, so I chose Daryl's name for this fictional story. The only one who had access to the money is another coworker, Daryl, whose shift ended just before yours. When you and your coworker discuss the issue, you both believe, based on previous experience, that Daryl took the money. You notice Daryl stuffing a couple of $20 bills into his pocket just as you came into the store before your shift, and your coworker reported that Daryl recently complained that he couldn't make ends meet on his low pay. Should you report Daryl? So again, you and your should you do that, or maybe just log the cash drawer shortage and let your supervisor decide what to do. Now, this is a kind of a moral dilemma, you could say, or whatever. It's a problem. But why is it a problem? So if you're going to debate this with your coworker, you're going to have a conversation about whether or not to do this. It could easily get heated, I think. You could take different opinions and you could not have stasis. But to really have a conversation about what you ought to do, if another person's involved, you probably want to try to get to some kind of stasis with this. So again, same process. You could ask yourself, does a problem exist? What is the problem? A couple of things can come up here. One problem would be that Daryl's going to be mad if you tell on him, or what will he retribution? Or, it's morally, is it wrong to just ignore this? Another really practical problem would be, what if you don't say anything and your manager blames you or your coworker, and then you come back and it just looks like you're trying to deflect onto Daryl, who didn't do anything? Another one is, what if you tell on Daryl, but really, do you have any evidence? So again, these are all problems, but the big problem is if you don't do anything, you could be in trouble. If you do something, you could kind of harm Daryl. So you'd have to go look at all these questions of fact. Does a problem exist? Yes. What's the problem? The money's missing. We know that. Questions of definition. What kind of thing is this? Well, we think it might be a crime. And if we decide that we think a crime's been committed, then that leads us into some other discussion. Is it a good or bad thing? Well, if it was a crime that was committed, it's definitely not something good. Should it be sought or avoided? And so on. So we probably don't want to have this happening. And then questions of policy. That's the most important question. What are we going to do? Given the situation, what actions are available? How will the proposed actions make the situation better or worse? So again, if we were in class, we could have a long discussion about this, and it'd probably be interesting to see what you guys would think about this. But you get the point. Any situation, a life situation, some of these controversial topics, we can use this stasis theory, asking these questions of fact, definition, quality, and policy to try to get to a place where we can actually debate what we want to do. So by the time we get down here, we might be just simply debating, do we turn Daryl in or do we not? And if we believe we don't have enough evidence to we're not convicting him, right? Then maybe there are other actions we could take. And you might think about this. I mean, some students have brought up before things like, why don't we just say the money's missing and not mention anything about Daryl? Do we have to actually turn him in? And that way, at least we're being honest, we're reporting it, but we're not, becoming judge and jury here. We really don't have that much evidence. So there's lots of ways you could approach this. But again, the idea is just to think about this idea of stasis. So think about the topic. If you haven't already gotten into Essay 6 or done Essay 6, you can think about this with Essay 7 as well. But what topic you're considering for the paper? What's the problem or concern that makes you want to write about this? What kind of thing is this problem or concern? Is it a certain type? So does it fit in some kind of category? Is this a good or bad thing? Should it be sought or avoided? So you're arguing for something or arguing against something, and then should some action be taken? And that might be your thesis. We should, or that could be your conclusion. We should do this or that. So again, stasis theory is, I wish we had time in class to really talk about this together, because I think we can reveal a lot more of how it's useful just by going through it. But if you can hopefully go through some of these questions as you think about your next essay topic, hopefully that'll help you get to a topic that's very arguable and that connects to not only your own preferences, but your audience and your opponent. There's always another side to the issue, and being aware of that and connecting to that well is a good way to make your point. So that was a long video. If you got to the end of this, congratulations. Thanks for watching this. And as always, let me know through email if you have any questions.